Bonjour à tous. On m'a demandé de donner cette présentation en anglais. Et j'ai un peu opposé au début parce que j'ai dit quand même j'ai appris le français à l'école puis pendant mon travail de terrain au Maroc et on me force dans un environnement francophone de parler en anglais, c'est un peu bizarre. Mais puisque j'ai préparé tout en anglais, je vais changer de langue. J'ai compris que vous comprenez tout très bien l'anglais. That's right. Donc, il n'y a pas de contrainte, parce que je ne veux pas que mon changement de langue va créer un problème de communication, parce que j'ai des choses à dire qui, à mon avis, sont importantes. Et j'espère que même en anglais, ça va arriver, la même chose qu'en français. En tout cas, pour la discussion, vous êtes libre de poser la question en français. Volontiers, je répondrai en français aussi. Alors, migration. Migration is a hot topic that raises high hope and very deep fears at the same time. High hopes for migrants, often, because for migrants it often means a hope for a better future, not just for the migrants, but also for the families they leave behind. But for societies, migration raises very deep fears. I think it's important to mention that this is not new at all. And if you go back to Roman times, the citizens of Rome already found that too many people came in from outside or the periphery of the Roman Empire into the city of Rome. If we go fast forward, we have the era of mobile phones now. If we go fast forward, let's say to the 19th century, many people have forgotten that, for instance, in the United States, Italians and Irish were seen as people who were impossible to assimilate. They were Catholic, they had rough manners, they didn't fit into the American mainstream. So that is not that long ago. And even a little bit further forward, a country like my country, the Netherlands, in the 1950s and 60s, Italian and Portuguese and Greek immigrants were seen as impossible to assimilate. They ate strange stuff like garlic. No Dutchman would eat garlic. They thought it would stink and the houses would smell badly. And again, there were discussions in the Netherlands. Actually, families were deported from Italy still in the 1960s, back to Italy from the Netherlands, because they were not seen as not being able to fit into the Dutch mainstream. I just want to highlight that because sometimes we focus so much on what happens today, we think everything is new. If we go a little bit further back in time, these are not issues that are new at all. Well, we can say, I think, that despite its hotly debated status, migration is one of the most poorly understood social issues of this time. So I fully support the idea that we need a sociology or a social science of migration. Xenophobic demagoguery has largely hijacked the debate, which has become largely fact-free. So what I'm going to address in this talk is, what do we actually know based on scientific evidence about processes of migration? Because it's actually surprising how little of the debate is really about migration. I mean, most of the debate is about the perceived impacts of migration on society. We know very little about what actually drives the process. We have a lot of assumptions, a lot of so-called certainties. I received ideas about what drives migration, what is the process of migration. Very little fact, very little research. And I even think the migration research community is guilty of that, because we always focus on what migration means for us, and us means the so-called advanced societies of the wealthy West. So what does migration mean? What is migration? And I think another problem of the debate is that it's very polarized, not just in the political sphere, but also in the academic sphere. I mean, overall migration is often framed as those who are in favor of migration and those who oppose migration, anti and pro-migration. That is the dominant way of framing the whole debate about migration. I think that is a totally naive and totally wrong way of having a debate about migration. Because what typically happens, both camps cave in at their own arguments, selectively use evidence that supports their case, and there is no real debate about what really drives the process of migration. Because to argue in favor or against migration is almost like arguing in favor or against, let's say, agriculture, or marriage, or trade. mean, as long as human beings have been around, there have been these institutions. So you cannot think it away. So to start with the debate in terms of are you pro or anti is a totally wrong way of beginning to talk about migration. And even the research community tends to do that as well. Most migration researchers tend to cave into the pro-migration argument, which I think is also dangerous as to cave into the anti-migration, because it's a non-scientific, it's a non-reflexive way of thinking about migration. It is a non-historical way of thinking about migration. Because if we take the notion seriously that migration is of all times, we need to take it really seriously and actually try to understand the process before we jump to value judgment and all sorts of taking positions on this issue. To say that migration is a fundamental feature of human mankind, of the way we live, because we are all moving around, doesn't mean that migration is good or bad. That's another discussion. To say migration is inevitable doesn't mean good or bad. But any policy or any political positioning about migration that tries to think away the fundamental fact that migration is here to stay is bound to fail. And I'm going to show some evidence supporting that argument. The fundamental point of my talk is that we need to fundamentally rethink the way we think about migration, away from those simplistic frames of anti and pro and can we use more migration or not. It's really about starting to really understand the process. We need a radically new vision on migration. And the basic point is we need to rethink migration as an intrinsic part of broader processes of global change and development rather than a problem to be solved. Because by and large, migration is framed both by the left and the right wing as somehow the antithesis of development or things going well. Because we often see migration as a problem that we need to solve either by giving development aid to origin countries or build a wall indeed and then it will all stop. Instead of thinking about what really drives migration, and this is so-called solutions we think about, are they really addressing what actually drives migration? And such a new vision is essentially not just to achieve a more realistic assessment of what policies cannot achieve, but also what they indeed can achieve in terms of managing migration, enhancing its positive impacts, and minimizing its negative impacts, because I think that should be the starting point. Not to think the phenomenon away, but how can we best deal with migration so that we can maximize the positive benefits of the phenomenon. Now, and to illustrate why we need a radically new vision on migration, I will discuss a number of received wisdoms, idées reçues, about migration. And because intuition is the worst guide to understanding migration. Because with migration, almost everything is different than you think at first instance, once you look at the facts. So throw away intuition and first look at the facts, which actually are quite upsetting, because we think certain things about migration that are in fact totally different in reality. And both left and right wing researchers and policymakers buy into a series of migration myths. And those myths and the dismantling of those myths illustrate the need for a more scientific approach. Well, the first myth is this idea that migration is at an all-time high and is accelerating fast. Now, obviously, that idea is very much reinforced by media images of boats crossing the Mediterranean, it has already been mentioned, the refugee crisis of last year. But more generally, if you look at the discourse, the rhetorics of politicians and in the media, you get this impression that more and more people are on the move, that migration pressure, that's another word you often hear, is building up on the borders of the wealthy West. And that sort of also ties in with the argument, if we don't do anything, masses of people will arrive and migration will become an uncontrollable phenomenon. This is not just a right-wing story. Also people on the left wing buy into the same argument when they say, well, if we don't give more development aid, they will all come here. They actually buy in similar ideas of a migration crisis that threatens to run out of hand. Also climate change activists, I mean, I deeply share, I just want to make that sure, the deep concerns about climate change. I think it's the main concern for our future. But to basically sell the migration, the climate change agenda with the idea, if we don't do anything about climate change, they will all come here, I think is again buying into this idea that migration is accelerating fast and that we face a global migration crisis. Because we don't even look at the facts. What is actually happening to migration? Well, we have some data, fortunately. The World Bank, the United Nations, they have been for decades busy trying to make estimates about the global number of migrants around the world. And a migrant is here defined as a person who is living for roughly over 1 year in another country than his or her country of birth. Now, if we look at that data, we have to sort of start to question the idea that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration. And this idea is, by the way, very much reinforced also by very serious academics like Paul Collier, a former colleague of mine at Oxford University, who has written this book. And the image is clear. The south is emptying to the north, and we face a global migration crisis. Now, well, if we look at the facts, and these are the estimates between 1960 and 2010 about the number of international migrants worldwide. At first sight, they seem to sustain this idea that from 1960 we had about 90 million international migrants, and more recently well above 200 million. But of course the world population has grown as well. And actually the world population has grown at exactly the same rate. So if we express this number as a percentage of the world population, we get this. Totally steady rate, around 3%. So it sort of defies this idea that with increasing global inequalities, environmental crises, growing wealth in the north, growing ease of transport and communication, that suddenly many more people are migrants in the world. In relative terms, that is not true. Because we would expect that with increasing inequality, increasing ease of travel and all of that, that actually more people are on the move than ever. Well, that picture doesn't really seem to sustain this argument. What about refugees then? Because if you sort of follow the debate, more recently, you have this impression that the quintessence of migration to Europe in particular is about refugees. Well, the truth is that refugee migration has been going up and down over many decades. If there is a war breaking out, like the Yugoslavia wars, particularly in Bosnia, early 1990s, we had a huge spike in migration of refugees. Again, we have one with the war in Syria, but actually expressed as a percentage of the world population, refugee migration is certainly not the most important source of migration. And in some regions, like in Africa, numbers of refugees have been going down over the last decades. In some regions, they've been going up, like recently indeed in Asia and Syria. The most recent developments haven't been included in those figures, but you see that figures have been going up and down. There is not a sort of huge spike. Now, if you express this as a percentage of the world migration population, you see here at your right hand that refugees represent a decreasing percentage of international migrants worldwide. That doesn't mean that refugee issues are not important or that refugees don't need support, but the idea that, and which we can easily get from recent developments in Europe, that refugee migration is the defining issue is actually, again, belied by the facts. A bit focusing in on the recent issue of Syrians coming to Europe, another misunderstanding is that refugees are all on the way to Europe. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has estimated that 86% of all refugees in the world are in the region, are basically in low to middle income countries. This is for two main reasons. Most refugees would like to stay very close to home, close to their families, would like to go back as soon as possible. It is a big misunderstanding that all refugees would then like to go to the West. And secondly, people who would like to do so often don't have the means. And actually the percentage of refugees worldwide that is staying close to home in the neighboring countries is going up and not down. So it's not true that more and more refugees find their way to Europe, North America and other wealthy countries. It's rather the other way around. And I think this sort of symbolizes the case of Syria, which is a case of a country with a relatively skilled and actually a middle-income country rather than a low-income country, relatively proximate to Europe. Even in that case, the large majority of Syrians who have been displaced by war either stay in their own country or have moved to neighboring countries. And what we've seen in Europe actually represents a small percentage of all refugees that have been on the move from a country like Syria. So I think that puts in perspective what's been happening. And if you then express the total number of refugees as a percentage of the total population of the European Union, then actually you also see that what is often seen as something totally unprecedented isn't really so unprecedented. Because during the Bosnia War in particular, and also other conflicts in the Middle East, the actual percentage was higher than it is now. So again, we need to put these things into perspective, that we face somehow a biblical crisis or something that totally unprecedented, which Europe hasn't seen before. Well, this expresses total refugees as a percentage of the world migrant population. I did this on purpose because refugees are so much into the spotlight right now, to show that actually the bulk of people moving around the world migrate for different reasons than conflict. So we neither see an exodus from poor countries, nor we face an invasion if we look at migration. Immigration has been high for the last decades in European countries. This is not necessarily a new phenomenon, but still, I would not say nothing has changed. What do you think has changed? Why do we think that there is much more migration than ever before? Any clues? I know you're students, so I always ask this question to my students. Why do we think there is much more migration than there is before? Because I think there are very good reasons why we think that, particularly in Europe. I give you a hint already when I say particularly in Europe. No clue at all? Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. Oh, sorry.
Peut-être les médias ou la politique qui axe sa campagne sur ça.
Je suis d'accord. On en parle plus, oui, sûrement.
Les idées reçues des gens.
Pardon?
Les idées reçues des gens.
Donc c'est une question de perception?
Oui, la mentalité.
Peut-être. Et peut-être aussi les réfugiés, quand ils arrivent en Europe, qui disent que c'est beaucoup plus paisible à leurs frères ou leur famille. Ou c'est bien en Europe, etc.
C'est
Qu'ils sont confortables, qu'ils ont été accueillis correctement. Peut-être ce niveau de message qui peut être transmis plus facilement entre Europe grâce à ces médias.
Donc plus janvier.
On est plus dans une phase de croissance énorme par rapport à avant.
Bon.
Moins besoin d'eux. Avant, on avait beaucoup plus de migrants, ils ont été beaucoup plus de main-d'œuvre. Maintenant qu'économiquement, on a une phase de croissance plus petite, on a moins besoin d'eux.
Oui. Oui. Non, c'est pas faux, mais je dis que pourquoi on pense qu'il y a beaucoup plus de migrants qu'avant? Pourquoi on pense qu'on vit dans une période de grande migration, plus grande que jamais? Et vous avez mentionné une raison très importante, et je vais en revenir, c'est la perception du phénomène, la politisation du phénomène, la médiatisation du phénomène, sûrement, ça joue un rôle. Mais il y a un vrai changement. Une autre question, quelle était la plus grande migration clandestine dans l'histoire humaine? Migration clandestine, c'est une migration vers un autre territoire sans demander l'autorisation des gens qui vivent là-bas. Oui, c'est ça. Pardon? Esclavage? C'est lié à ce phénomène, mais c'est un phénomène beaucoup plus grand que ça. Colonisation en général. Et ça me fait revenir à une chose. Parce qu'on croit qu'on vit dans une ère très transnationales et super diverses. Je ne suis plus d'accord. C'est un regard européen. It were the Europeans that for 5 centuries, we had a great lecture yesterday, I think, that really set the ground for what we're doing today. We come from 5 centuries of Europeans moving out, colonizing, conquering with a lot of violence other territories, occupying those territories without asking any permission, and then later on having lots of migrants going there as settlers, particularly to the Americas, but also other countries like Algeria, South Africa, and some places in East Asia, without asking any permission. And that has been, of course, the most dominant movement. And up to 1950, the dominant migration movement in the world were that of Europeans moving to other places. And in a turnaround, a fundamental shift, which I call the global migration reversal, Europe has transformed itself from the global source of migrants to the global destination of migrants. That has been the fundamental game changer in global migration. So global migrant rates haven't gone up. I mean, there are even estimates much older, centuries ago, that again show that the total number of migrants in the world hasn't so much increased. It's the dominant direction of migrations. Europeans have appropriated themselves the right to colonize and dominate the rest of the world. Since the Second World War, with decolonization, rapid economic growth in Europe, and demographic decline, Europe has become the global migration destination. And these are estimates of comparing migration to the EU 25. I'm sorry, Swiss is not included, but it fits nicely the picture. And the US, and we always think about the US as the destination. No, Europe attracts twice as much migrants now from outside the European country union every year than the United States of America. Of course, EU 25 is almost double the population of the US, so in terms of rates, it's roughly similar. You talk about 520 million people. But it shows something that Europe, of course, from a European perspective, this is indeed a big game changer, and there has been a real change. But this had global implications, because since Europe was the prime source of migrant labor for the Americas, both South and North America, also Australia and New Zealand, their source of migrants dried up. And one of the reasons those countries abolished their racial immigration criteria was not only ethical and humanistic reasons, but also they needed to have migrants, they wanted migrants, these are immigration nations, and they started to allow migrants coming in from other regions. And so migration has become increasingly Latin American, Asian, and to some extent African. So the global migration population has become de-Europeanized and increasingly become non-European. And of course that also has fundamental implications of the ethnic makeup of a society like the United States, and probably the election somehow reflects some sort of backlash against that very fundamental and inevitable demographic change going on. So it shows that really something has been happening. But of course, you have mentioned it, there is the politicization of the issue. Switzerland, by the way, is an excellent case, including, but also my own country, the Netherlands, of how migration has become politicized. I always include these in my lectures, but now I'm in Switzerland finally. I don't have to explain you where this comes from. Neither this one. This is my own proud country. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, he may well win the next elections in March. Meer veiligheid, minder immigratie. He directly makes a link between security, veiligheid and security, less immigration, more security. There you go. I've lived for 10 years in the UK. That's a great country again for migration, fear-mongering. Migrants send our crime rate soaring on a daily. We must stop the migration invasion. And of course, the Brexit. We had this image, totally deceitful message, by the way, because this was an image taken in Hungary, making the impression that England is being flooded by migrants. And you know the consequence, that migration played a big role in the vote for Brexit. And more recently, Trump arguing that they are sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're bringing rapists. And the rapist argument, the fear of the dark man as a potential rapist, has become very popular again. Also in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders used this argument all the time. Again, this is not something new, because also Italian and Spanish young men in the Netherlands were accused of taking away our women. I mean, that shows something different about how people think about women, but it's a different case. But I would argue this is not just an issue of extremist politicians. Mainstream politicians, in somehow a diluted way, have been moving in the same direction. There's some good political science literature studying party manifestos to show that the entire political camp has moved in a more xenophobic direction. My own Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, here third from the right, this is during the so-called Turkey deal, the Turkey deal about refugees, argued in the months running up to this Turkey deal that if we don't stop this refugee invasion, it will be like the downfall of the Roman Empire. He literally said that. And we know, of course, historians have already debunked the whole notion that the barbarian invasions were the ultimate cause of the downfall of the Roman Empire. That was internal weakening, probably. There's a long debate about that. But he used his argument seriously. If we don't stop this, we will see the same fate as the Roman Empire. The refugees will bring down Europe. This is a map from a prospectus study from the very respectable Dutch Ministry of Defense. Again, showing those purple arrows, because of environmental degradation, war, drugs, all sorts of problems, all these people will come to the West. And the underlying argument is that we need a military to stop those people from coming. And this is actually what you see right now on the Mediterranean. We seek justification for defense. And the danger is no longer Russians invading, but it is about refugees invading our countries. So again, migration has become a highly toxic and politicized issue, not just by those right-wing lunatics. It has become mainstreamed in many ways. The narrative about migration at an all-time high and being an ultimate threat for Western societies. Second myth. Can I have some water? I think yes. Development in poor countries will reduce migration. You often hear this by people who say border controls don't work because you can build walls, and we've been trying to do that for so many years. It doesn't really solve the problems. We need development, and it sounds like a great argument. The problem is that the argument is flawed scientifically. It is tempting to say, well, we have all these poor people on boats, and so they seem destitute and desperate, so if we do something about it, those people won't arrive anymore. Well, at a more fundamental level, this is based on the so-called push-pull model. And you all know about this model. We have had it in primary or secondary school, and in Switzerland they do that as well at primary, secondary school, push-pull? No? Anyway, they do it in the UK. This is a primary school book, by the way. They do it in the Netherlands. In scientific, of course, university education, often you hear push-pull. I think push-pull is really rubbish. Push-pull is something like saying, if you have supply and demand, you will have trade. Fine enough, I agree. So push-pull is something to say like, if circumstances back home are worse than in the destination, people move. Fine, I agree, everybody can agree. It's a sort of fundamental assumption. It doesn't explain anything. Because based on that model, and also neoclassical thinking, migrants as cost-benefit calculators, going for the best opportunities, would expect you to see the biggest migration flows from the poorest countries, right? The higher the levels of destitution, and the bigger the difference in the gains migrants can make, the more people will be on the move. That's the assumption, and that's also the underlying assumption when we say, oh, we need to bring development to Africa. I mean, the Swiss have been very active at this as well, the Swiss government, by the way, not accuse you. I've been very effective, active in sort of advocating this agenda, right? We need development, not migration. The problem is in the data. And whether you like migration or not, you will have to consider the data. So I say, push-pull, we need to forget about it. We should no longer teach it in secondary school, no longer at universities, because it gives us a fundamentally flawed idea and actually a totally misleading model of thinking about migration. Get away with it. Look at the data. I took the Human Development Index. You know what it is? It's a composite index which sort of is a measure of the level of development in countries. And it sort of averages economic levels, GDP per capita, life expectancy, and literacy. These are the sort of big components of what we often see as human development. So I took all countries in the world, about 180, and I developed them in 5 so-called quintiles, which are equally big groups, from very low levels of human development, so levels of literacy, life expectancy, and economic development, to very high. And certainly the whole of Western Europe is in this column, and a lot of sub-Saharan African countries are in the very low column. Now, the first statistic I generated was to calculate what is the percentage of the population of those countries on average that are immigrants. Now, this shows totally what we expect to find, is that the more developed a country, the higher percentage of their population is migrants. And in the very high group, we see that well above 14% on average of populations of highly developed countries are immigrants. Now, for Switzerland, it's way higher. It is always higher for small countries because small countries have a higher number of people moving out as well. And it's, in a way, it shows one thing, that there is a certain inevitability about migration. Because if you become wealthy, open, attractive, you're going to attract a lot of migrants, whether you like it or not. Policies can do something about it, but they cannot be quite naive to think they can sort of reverse this pattern. But this is still what you would expect, right? The intuition is right. The surprise is in the following one, where I tried to calculate what percentage of those different countries, according to those different development levels, lives abroad. It's the poorest countries that have the lowest emigration rates in the world. It's the middle income countries that have the highest immigration rates in the world. These are the Mexicos, the Philippines, the Moroccos, the Turkeys of the world. These are not the poorest countries. And why is that the case? Again, if you think a bit through, it's not so difficult to understand. Migration requires a lot of resources. You're not just going to leave except if there's a really war going on, but you're not just going to leave your family behind if you don't have resources to make that journey. It requires a lot, and you want to leave your family in safety, right? So it requires a lot of resources, connections, so-called social capital, knowledge, to be able to make that move. And the biggest majority of migrants come legally on visas, and it requires a lot of money and often qualifications in order to be able to move in the first place. So in countries that have so-called higher levels of literacy, income, there will be more people who can afford to migrate. Even paying a smuggler across the Mediterranean is very expensive if you consider income levels in African countries. I think the second reason goes beyond the economic. This has to do with aspirations. You know, once you go to secondary school, you're very unlikely to be willing to work on the farm anymore. You aspire for more in your life. You aspire for a different type of life. And every one of us, including myself, who grown up in a small town or a village, knows that experience from your own life. You don't have to go to Africa to understand how that works. People want to move to cities, they want to move abroad, and with development, more people get on the move. That is also why the so-called developed countries are so migratory. We still move around a lot to get a particular education. Once we have that education, we have to look for jobs, and again, we move a lot. If you're a farm worker, you're much less likely to be able but also be willing to actually move because you can find a job locally. Well, and there's infrastructure and all sorts of other reasons why in highly developed countries more people tend to get on the move. So it actually means we have to fundamentally rethink what actually drives migration, because in many ways it is development that drives migration. And it sort of turns around this idea that development will reduce migration. It is a fundamentally problematic, non-scientific argument that simply does not fly. The third argument, migration leads to a brain drain. This is often used by people who don't like migration. They say, well, migrants better not come because it's a brain drain. I think there is a problem here. First of all, it sort of assumes that migrants don't know what they're doing, or that migrants are responsible for their government or country of origin, whereas migrants have their own reasons for coming. But there is also a scientific problem. There has been very good research on the so-called brain drain. For instance, Angel is one, but there is also Michael Clements from in the United States, who did not deny that, for instance, the migration of medical personnel can create problems, but sort of contest the idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this is the fundamental cause of healthcare problems, for instance, in West Africa. these were much deeper rooted. People left those countries, either they couldn't get a job in the sector or the work circumstances were so bad that they moved out. So it reflected much deeper issues in the medical healthcare sector. So you cannot simply run the argument that migration is the cause for underdevelopment or other problems in origin countries. And the other issue is that migrants send back a lot of money. I mean, this is a graph that compares the total amount of money sent back by migrants to origin countries in the so-called developed world and official development aid, which is way higher than official development aid. And we know that many migrants send back much more money informally or take back goods home. So it actually shows how important migration is for families back home. That doesn't, of course, mean that migration can then solve all sorts of migration problems, because there has been a sort of hype about 10 years ago about migration, and I know there's other people going to talk about this issue, about migration being a sort of solution to development problems. I think that is again overstating the possible positive impacts. Of course, migrants help along their families and communities, with the idea that migrants alone can certainly solve much more structural problems of corruption and unattractive investment conditions and political problems is, of course, naive too. And we may indeed overestimate what migration can do. And that actually also goes for what migration does to destination countries. Because there's this whole debate about integration, and do migrants take away jobs, and is it fiscally sustainable to have so many immigrants? And again, the press is a great source, particularly in the UK. Migrants are told find work in 6 months or no benefits. On the other side, migrants take all new jobs in Britain. I don't really know how you can square both. That is another issue. But of course, the idea of we need to put our own workers first is a politically hot topic. And the coexistence of high unemployment and immigration is for many politicians a reason to say we need to stop migration, because we first need to put to work our own populations. Why do we need migrants? Well, the problem is, as long as we don't introduce slavery in Western European societies, we can simply not force people to do certain types of work that they don't want to do. Even in countries that have no extensive social welfare systems, like for instance Morocco or Mexico or the United States, migrants do often jobs that local people don't want to do, rather have no income than do those jobs. Well, I don't have time to go into the theory, but there is a great theory developed by Michael Piore in 1979 already, segmented labor market theory, where he explains why migrants simply want to pick up jobs that locals don't want to do. And that is a fundamental problem. But there is also very good economic research about the impact of migration on unemployment and income and all sorts of other economic variables that generally swipes away this whole argument that migrants take away jobs, because generally migrants fill in jobs that locals don't want to take. Also, if you look at impacts on economic growth, we actually find that migration has very little impact, neither very negative, neither very positive. So migration isn't the big game changer. So migrants often fill in gaps in the labor market that are not filled locally, but the generic image that this then sort of drives locals out of the labor market cannot really be sustained by data. Actually, who faces the bigger threat of more migrants is previous migrants, who tend to be in those jobs themselves. But I also think that the pro-migration, migration economists have hugely overstated the economic benefits of immigration. Because they always focus on, the entrepreneurs, the companies, the innovation coming in, and of course migrants making our tomatoes cheaper and making all sorts of services here cheaper. But that mainly benefits the already better off, the middle classes, the higher classes, the business owners. They benefit disproportionately from migration. If you look at the so-called distributional impacts in terms of incomes of lower, middle, and higher income, you see indeed that immigration boosts incomes of middle and higher income groups, because it makes their life easier, it allows them to buy in services like cleaning in their house, for instance, cheaper, and makes them more productive. But actually the low income groups don't benefit from immigration at all economically, and in some cases indeed lose out. And I think that's a critical note towards the immigration research community, because they tend to be sort of cozying up to the pro-immigration agenda. I think there's a real issue here. And I'm going to come back to that when I finish my talk. There are some real policy dilemmas here. The second The second last myth I want to address is this idea that migration can solve the aging problem. That's another thing you often hear from the pro. And I again keep on repeating, I both think the pro and anti-migration positions are naive. Migration can solve the aging problem. Do you really think so? I think we hugely exaggerate. Again, you saw that 3% of migrants globally, people globally are migrants. I think we hugely exaggerate what migrants can actually do. Because a study by the Population Division of the UN, for instance, showed that levels of migration needed to offset population, offset population aging need to be extremely large. For Germany, for instance, offsetting aging by migration would require annual net migration of more than 3.5 million, which is more than 12 times higher than average migration to Germany right now. This is plainly unrealistic. It is socially not desirable to have such extreme levels of immigration, but I think there's a deeper problem, and that is that we think that there are so many countries around with potential migrants. We also don't realize what is happening in the world at large. This is, for instance, an example of fertility rates. On the below lines you see some European countries, but China on the dotted line, and a number of Turkey, Morocco, and which other country? Turkey, Morocco, and Mexico. You see a huge fertility decline. A country like Morocco went from 7.2 fertility in 1960 down to almost replacement levels right now. And many of the big immigration countries like Mexico, Morocco, Turkey are seeing declining immigration rates because they, in a way, are beyond their big demographic potential. And that begs the question, where will future migrants come from? And we sort of assume in Europe there's always these people wanting to come to Europe. Well, the real question for the future is where will migrants come from and where they will go to? Africa is a great case in point. Because by any means, any form of development in sub-Saharan Africa will boost migration. The real question is where will those migrants go to? The majority most likely within Africa, because many Africans move to other African destinations like South Africa or Gabon or Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria or Ethiopia or Kenya these days. More and more Africans go to China. Look at what's happening in China in terms of demographics. This is the world population pyramid right now. This is how it will look in 2050. But look at China. This is China in 1970, China 2010, and this is China in 2050. So if China retains some level of political stability, China is bound to become a global migration magnet. Where are those migrants coming from? Nobody knows. But with migration, never assume business as usual. And the sort of sloppy assumption we now have in Europe based on basically the last 30 to 40 years experience that everybody will want to come to Europe needs to be questioned. Well, the last idea is that immigration restrictions reduce immigration, right? It sounds so normal. You build a wall, you put a visa in, less people will come. Which is actually true, but it is a very one-sided analysis. And that type of analysis is not an analysis of the migration process, because we are so much focused on who comes in that we miss the other side of the story. What is the impact on returns, for instance, of immigration restrictions? Now, we have run a very large project at the University of Oxford for 5 years, using a lot of data, a lot of quantitative tests. I'm not going to bore you with statistics, but I'm going to give you what we found in terms of the potential counterproductive effects of immigration restrictions. And there are 4, which we called substitution effects. So this is the idea of a balloon. You squeeze it at one point, and migration pops up in another form. The first is simply migrants change category. So if you squeeze off the labor channel, migrants are likely to come either without permission or as family migrants or on some other ticket like a student migrant. And that is, I think, a well-known phenomenon. So this is why it sometimes seems to be successful, but migrants simply pop up in another legal identity. The second effect I really find interesting. It's the intertemporal substitutions. Migrants may simply adjust the timing of their migration. The independence of Suriname, which was a Dutch colony in South America, is a good example. The Dutch government in the 1970s was getting worried about the free migration of Dutch citizens, because Surinamese used to be Dutch citizens, to the Netherlands. So they accelerated independence in 1975. And the Surinamese new government negotiated a deal that up to 1980, Surinamese could freely migrate to the Netherlands and take up Dutch citizenship. What do you think Surinamese thought? It's now or it is never. So a huge migration spike in 1975, and another huge one just before visas were introduced in 1980. And this is how half of the Surinamese population ended up within a 10-year period in the Netherlands. So the completely counterproductive result of what policies had intended to do. The same happened with the British, the Commonwealth Migration Act in 1962, that sparked a huge beat-to-ban rush from the so-called West Indies, countries like Jamaica, to the UK, just before it was too late. But I think the most important downside of immigration restrictions is that it interrupts circulation. Migration naturally is about people moving back and people moving to a country and moving back. This is traditional circulation of migration. Now what happens if you put in a barrier, less people will go back as well. And we estimated this statistically, and indeed travel visas, for instance, but all other migration restrictions reduce circulation. And the effect, and this is important, on average, the immigration reducing effect of a visa is as big as the return migration reducing effect. So the effect on net migration is virtually zero. So, and that poses policymakers with fundamental dilemmas, because on the one hand you want to stop unlimited migration, but you're also going to squeeze up the circulation that policymakers so much want to see. And I'm being told I need to stop. But the last one I think is more intuitive. It's this idea of geographical diversion, spatial substitution. We have seen it with the building of fences in Melilla and Ceuta, northern Morocco, had a sort of quasi-militarization of borders. People have taken other ways to cross borders. And this is a 25-year-old phenomenon. I want to emphasize that. Sometimes we think this is just the last few years. This has been going on ever since 1991, which was the year in which southern European countries were forced to introduce visas for North Africans to come to Europe as part of the Schengen Agreement. That was the kickoff of the so-called boat migration phenomenon, which in recent years has become bigger, partly because of refugee crisis in Syria, but is a very old phenomenon in many ways, created by border controls. And of course, there are some very serious lethal consequences. We have very good research showing that the death toll has been rising with the level of controls. It has, of course, created a market for smuggling, and it has also increased the death toll of people wanting to cross borders. So we can speak about a lethal vicious circle of more migrant deaths, more moral panic in the media, more so-called calls to fight people smuggling, more anti-smuggling measures, but actually make smuggling more dangerous, and migrants die actually more. The death rate has soared in recent years. So these are some examples why migration policies often don't work. Well, I have to skip a few slides because I've been told I have 40 minutes, so I have 1.5 minutes left, which is not much. But I'll try to wrap this up with some considerations which are important. What should be done? Are you trying to say there is no problem? Est-ce que vous êtes en train de me dire qu'il n'y a pas de problème? But because that's what I often get the response. You're very good at showing how policies don't work and what works and what not works. So you're not so good at actually showing what should be done. Well, I think I'm going to skip a few graphs, but I want to show you one at least. By the way, I just want to show you this one. I apologize. It is too nice to not show. You know, the Turkey deal. We all think that the Turkey deal has brought down migration of refugees from Syria. Here is the evolution of Syrians arriving in Germany in this case, and this is the Turkey deal. I just want to show this, how we often get deceived by political rhetoric. That actually doesn't show up in the data at all. But the political claim has been made, the elections are being won with this argument, we've stopped it through the Turkey deal, and this is what really matters for politicians. There's one other graph I want to show you. No, I'll leave it here. I'm going to skip a lot.
What was the trigger?
Sorry?
What was the trigger for the reduction of
Probably networks that sort of petered out at some point. Probably also the so-called Hungarian sort of efforts. So there were a lot of things put on the way, but it's also partly because the migration networks had already let come over people who they wanted. There's still a big debate about this. We still don't really know. But the claim that the Turkey deal stopped the flow is simply not showing up in the data because the flow already went down. by a large degree before that. I want to show this graph, and it's a very important graph, because by and large migration is seen as a phenomenon, particularly if people come from non-European countries, as something driven by misery and underdevelopment. You already showed that this is a problematic assumption, but the big elephant in the room is that the big driver of immigration is simply labor demand in Western countries. This is a graph, you can run this for many countries, including Switzerland, showing net migration rates and a moving average of economic growth. And both follow each other rather neatly. And in a way, it tells a story about migration also driven fin, on m'a dit. Okay, I will really stop it. I want to say some concluding points. I was initially told I had a full hour, so I apologize for taking too much time. But what should be done? We are much better at pointing out what does not work than what works. But I think the whole framing of the debate in open and closed borders denies a much more nuanced practice of policymakers. Policy are about selection, not about numbers. Migration is not a tap you can turn on and off, you saw it in the graph. It is a sort of naturally occurring socioeconomic phenomenon. I think what we can do is 4 things. First of all, to correct the crisis framing. Overall, policies work. I also think migration researchers are guilty of saying policies all don't work. The large majority of migrants in a country like Switzerland or the Netherlands or the UK are perfectly legal. So the idea that policies have all failed is simply not true. In some cases they do fail, but that's not a majority. Second, provide better evidence on effectiveness of migration policies and present resulting policy dilemmas. Like, okay, I want to reduce immigration, what will be the effect on returns? They actually may cancel each other out, in which case you do the exact opposite of what you intended to do. 3, show that the vision of pro- and anti-migration agendas is naive. Also, so-called pro-immigration researchers have sided too closely with the open border agendas and have overstated the positive effects of migration. So I think we need to take unease among certain sections of the population with migration seriously, but also provide straight talk to policy in public. And this is my main point, and then I will really stop. My main point is there is a fundamental contradiction between 2 big political trends in the West. On the one hand, ever since the 1980s, we have seen, since Thatcher and Reagan came to power, what we call the neoliberalization of economic policies, which means freeing of trade, freeing of the banking sector, deregularizing the labor market, more and more precarious labor. We have wanted this as a political community. This is not something that happened to us. These are choices made by people who vote for parties that have enacted those policies. And this has been the big trend. We've created open, thriving economies with very flexible labor markets, where hiring and firing has become easier. At the same time, a growing political call for less immigration. I don't think there's anything morally reprehensible of a community wanting to have slightly lower levels of immigration. If you want that as a political community, fine. But you cannot have both at the same time. We cannot construct Switzerland as a great example of an open, thriving, wealthy economy with flexible labor markets and not have high levels of immigration. It's either or, it's not and. And I think these should be the real questions of the future. Because we know if you have an economy that attracts a lot of labor, that is thriving, like Switzerland, if you're really going to close borders, we know migrants come in a different way, or migrants will stay and not return anymore. It creates all sorts of perversities we don't want. The real discussion should be about the type of societies we want to live in. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.